right. So we've spent the last couple classes looking at different ways to ask questions to get the most information and the most beneficial information from our clients or whoever we're talking to. So when we are asking the questions, we have kind of that responsibility and duty and role to tuck all of their information in the back of our heads and start looking for different types of things that will help us better serve the client. So we don't ask questions just to get information. We get the information to be able to then begin assessing and creating interventions. That's our end goal, is to be able to get to the point where we can help them, give them something tangible to work on and change in whatever way they see fit. So this video is going to look at different things to look for when asking questions. And so this is one of those skills that comes with practice. Oftentimes at the beginning, we're so focused on asking good and right questions, and that our brains are very focused on that. It can be hard to retain what they're actually saying, in being able to observe and identify some of the things. So this is putting it on your awareness that really with all of our lines of questioning, these are types of things that we're looking for that we can pounce on, I guess, latch onto, maybe that's a better word, that we can latch onto in order to then start making progress and assess. So patterns are one of the things that you want to look for when asking questions. So patterns are the repeated behavioral or affective sequences. It's a very clinical definition. Patterns are things that clients will do over and over, whether verbally or maybe they're doing it with their nonverbals. So some common patterns observed in client stories include avoidance of something. So maybe it's an avoidance of intimacy, frequent angry outbursts. So that would be something more behavioral versus saying something. Maybe they're always crying when they're anxious. They're having an addiction to substances or people, picking inappropriate partners. And so some of these things are maybe they're not even conscious that they're doing. So if we're hearing a client express some of these things over and over, we have the opportunity to reflect back that this pattern is existing and maybe to explore that further. There can be positive patterns. So the ones that were mentioned before are some of those like negative problems, deficit type of thinking. But we can also note that people might have patterns such as choosing loyal friends, asserting oneself in adversity, protecting vulnerable people, using spiritual resources, having really good coping around problems, and reflecting back those patterns as well can kind of go back to that strengths mentality where in the solution focused type therapy, where you're looking at the things they're bringing to the table already. So patterns can help us in that way, where we can identify strengths and resources and supports, but it also can help us identify maybe problematic or maladaptive behaviors. So here are examples of patterns that might show up, that every time a topic of a relationship comes up, so maybe the relationship they have with their father, the client will change the subject. And so there's some avoidance there of not wanting to talk about their father relationship. Another example would be your client always identifies someone else as the source of their problem and doesn't take responsibility for their choices. So that's a great reflection to make back. Let's say that client specifically is coming to you for they're having a hard time keeping and maintaining friends. Well, if you're identifying the pattern of them identifying as everybody else as the problem, that could be a really good thing to reflect back on and explore in regards to like their ultimate goal of keeping and maintaining friends. Ways to, I'm going to go back to the first slide so I go back on patterns. So ways to kind of, if you're observing and noticing patterns, reflections are a very good way to invite that into the conversation in the space. So being like, I've noticed that you don't like to talk, like when I start talking about your dad, we usually change the subject. Can you help me explore that a little bit more? So kind of doing that reflection and then asking the permission to explore that. You don't want to necessarily reflect some of those negative patterns back in a way that makes them feel defensive or judged because they're avoiding it for some reason, whether it's because they're uncomfortable or there's some distressing emotion attached to it. So you really want to be tactful when you reflect some of those avoidant patterns. When you're expressing and reflecting some of the more positive patterns, like, hey, like, I've noticed that every time you get broken up with, you maintain a real positive attitude towards dating still. So something that's kind of weird. But something like that, you can reflect that back in more of a celebratory way. Another thing which is very similar to patterns is themes that come up. So those are the repeated set of ideas, beliefs, and notions. So they might be aware in their expressing of their beliefs. So if they are somebody who might have a pattern of blaming themselves, they might interject during the conversation, like, oh, well, there I go again, blaming myself. So sometimes higher functioning clients who've either been in therapy for a while or just have higher self-awareness might be able to actually express the themes themselves. And that's really helpful for therapists because then you can kind of jump on that because they've already spoken it into the space and you don't have to necessarily introduce the concept. However, they often do emerge indirectly and without the client's conscious recognition. So, for example, when a client describes a persecuting sibling in one session, so a sibling that is kind of attacking them or getting on them, maybe then they start talking about a persecuting significant other in another, someone who's always ragging on them, getting on them, bothering them. But then when they're talking about work, that there's always an employer there who's ragging on them, getting on them. Then they have annoyance that the clinician is running the show and getting them on them to like do their homework, answer a question. Well, there's a theme right there that every person that's identified has now been considered persecuting or annoying in some manner. And so that might indicate that they're having trouble opening up themselves or they're to deeper conversations. So this is a defense mechanism of pushing people away, or maybe they have this victim mentality and they have to kind of address that. And so it's similar to the patterns in the sense that you're seeing things over and over. Themes just kind of have like this overarching, like it kind of embeds himself in everything that they talk about. So clinicians commonly incur client themes of loss, betrayal, oppression, injustice, hopelessness, despair, and on the flip side, there's like courage, persistence, survival, and resistance to oppression. So, if you think about the theme, like if you go to a dance and the theme is like under the sea, that's going to be incorporated in like all the decorations and the food and the beverages, the invitations, those types of things. And so it's kind of interwoven into the whole context. That's similar to like what a theme is in a client's life. It's some kind of like, I don't want to say topic, but commonality that's interwoven into everything. Versus the pattern, go back to the pattern, it's more repeated behaviors or something that they're doing in different in sequence. That's kind of that minor distinction between the two. So, a clinician needs to pay careful attention to these themes and patterns while they arise in the interview. Sometimes you might notice them consistently through one session sitting down, or you might recognize them over a succession of different interviews. So these themes and patterns may be the things that the clinician notes during the specific interviews. So like you can either just mentally note it or reflect it back to them, or the client might reveal themselves over time. And sometimes these patterns are nonverbal. So if you notice that every time you talk about spiders, the client starts to sweat, that would be an indicator. Every time you bring up spiders, they have dilated pupils, they sweat, fight or flight kind of responses. That might be an indicator that they have a fear of spiders. It's a pattern that you have identified over time. It's something that you could reflect, even though they haven't really said it. Although I don't know why you'd be talking about spiders in multiple therapy sessions, but that's neither here nor there. So patterns and themes. The final one to kind of look for is clients talking in metaphors. So this is an English term we probably learned about in our lit and rhetoric classes. But a metaphor is a figure of speech that makes an implicit comparison between two unlike entities. So you could say, like, your smile was like 1,000 sunshines on a cloudy day. So comparing the smile to 1,000,000 sunshines on a cloudy day. That is an example of a metaphor. So it creates a new frame or altered frame on an old story or situation. And so if the client was feeling depressed, but then shared that on the way up to your office in the elevator, somebody told them that their sunshine or their smile was like 1,000,000 sunshines, it kind of paints a different picture than them saying like, oh yeah, the person told me they liked my smile. It would give the same message, but it kind of gives you some more content to talk around, and I will talk about that kind of on the next slide. So metaphors are really helpful because it helps clients entertain new experiences, reduces resistance to considering new ideas, gets them thinking, meets the client's kind of how they paint the picture of the world, respects the communication of the client, because you'll see in the next slide, like we kind of reflect back using the language of the metaphor. So it mirrors and models that we're entering into the conversation, how they are speaking, and it develops new resources from within. So metaphors do involve signs, symbols, rituals, and everyday customs and objects. And they involve a word or idea which is used in place of another word or idea. So it does allow for transportation from one sensory modality to another. So if you use example like, oh, it tasted like silk. Well, taste is one sensory modality. Silk would be more of like a feeling modality, and it kind of brings you from one to another and kind of enhances the experiences. So here are some examples of metaphors that are probably better than my smile is like sunshine. I don't ever think I'll get to first base. So that's different way to describe maybe a romantic and physical intimacy. Might be a little bit safer for a client to use a metaphor versus talking more in specific like intimacy details. You then would join into the line of questioning of like, well, what do you think it would take to get you to first base? Or you could kind of play on that baseball metaphor and be like, well, have you ever been up to bat before? And that feels a little bit different than like, well, have you ever dated anybody before? It kind of enters into maybe a more comfort zone that the clients might feel more comfortable talking about. My radar has been out all day. I feel crucified. Life is a puzzle. Life is like a box of chocolates. I'm trapped like a rat. He acts like a friendly shark. Life is like a box of chocolates. So it's the client's expressing something within the metaphor, and then the therapist and social worker kind of fleshes that out, what that means to the client, and kind of joins in the story with them. Whoops, I went to Simon Birch on accident. So how you would maybe use the metaphor in a purposeful way. You could say, so that this client is having a struggle maybe with their identity. And that they're saying, you know, like, I feel like nobody really knows what I am inside. I might look like just like everybody else on the outside, but inside I'm something so different. And I just feel like I'm just this generic chocolate inside of a box that nobody knows what's inside. And so you could like expound on that and be like, well, tell me about the different types of what might be inside a chocolate inside that box. And they might say like orange ooey gooey stuff. Be like, okay, tell me what the orange ooey gooey stands for. Well, that stands for someone who's really lovey and mushy. And then they go and describe different ones. And you could ask like, well, what chocolate would you say you were inside of here? I would maybe be the caramel. Okay, what would you want people to experience when they choose you? And so it just kind of fleshes out a little bit more of insecurity talk without necessarily focusing and directly talking about